Καλησπέρα σας. Σας καλωσορίζουμε στην τρίτη διάλεξη που διοργανώνει η Ομάδα Κριτικής Μουσικής Ιστοριογραφίας. Σήμερα μαζί μας έχουμε τον Θέρμη, ο οποίος έχει έρθει από τη Νέα Υόρκη και θα μας μιλήσει με αφορμή το βιβλίο του Xenakis in America. Welcome and thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Excuse me, glasses. Thank you all for coming. I'd certainly like to thank Danai for having the idea to invite me here, and the number of people that have worked behind the scenes to organize this that don't believe have been credited, at least not to my knowledge. But thank you all. It's certainly an honor to be here in Thessaloniki and able to speak to you today about Xenakis and the work I did on his projects in America. I don't know if any of you want to shift your chairs, but some of the material that I'm showing has small type, so if you don't find that readable and want to read it, you might want to move a little closer. I'll mention about the illustrations. Over the course of my research, I collected a lot of material that was found quite interesting in and of itself, and have always wanted an excuse to show some of it off. So I selected 25 images for my talk, which will run about a half an hour. And they're grouped according to Tanglewood, Ypsilanti, and Bloomington, but don't have any direct relationship to what I might be reading in my talk. So the arbitrary conjunction of image and what I'm saying might be strange at moments, but hopefully it will be interesting. We'll see. So I'll start here. I suppose I should start by explaining the title of my talk today. The computer science of the 1980s had a number of strategies for problem solving. Perhaps the best known is top-down solution, or solving the conceptual difficulties at the highest level first, and afterwards moving down to the details of implementation. Other strategies are less famous, for example, easy to hard, but the natural counterpart to top-down was a bottom-up strategy, solving all the details, and then moving up, so to speak, to solve the more abstract aspects of the subject. Xenakis in America is a work of primary research, and as such, I spent a lot of time examining details, fragments of paper or 40-year-old memories, to produce an image that claims fidelity to them and suggests something at work among them. Xenakis in America is partly the study of an individual producer, a narrative of what Xenakis did to create his compositions. It's also partly a reception study, an account of what others at the time thought of his art and activities. But I ask the question here, can we arrive at an understanding of modernism through a bottom-up consideration such as this? Can that link be established through everyday detail, or must we concentrate on the compositions and the discourse around them? And if the link can't be made, what is it we see when we bring the facts into focus? I ask this because I wonder whether a consideration of Xenakis' biography, to use that term, changes that abstraction we hold as modernism. Taking that a bit further, do we need to speak of what they achieved in their work? Taking that a bit further, do we need to spend more time investigating the activities of post-war composers before we can speak of what they achieved in their work? This evening I'll talk about 4 aspects of creating my book: topic formation, issues of documentation, things I chose to leave out, and finally, areas of undecidability in my narrative. I hope these aspects will give you a sense of the gray areas in my work, stuff that more or less got cleaned up in the forming of the finished product. I'll talk about my topic in 2 parts, here at the beginning as I first understood it, and at the end in terms of what I perceive on completion. My first motivation for the project was amazingly simple. My residence in the United States suggested a contribution to our knowledge of Xenakis not easily made by European scholars. What's more, the accessible literature suggested a longer and deeper relationship with America than other countries, with the exceptions of France, Greece, and possibly Japan. I might say that Germany or England had been better hosts for their commissions and performances, but it was Xenakis' other compositional activity in America that gave importance to the subject for me. These other activities, such as building hardware for computer sound synthesis or collaborating on ancient Greek tragedies, suggested institutional affiliations in the US and a corresponding reduction in autonomy that composing at a desk retains. Along with the lack of information about Xenakis in the US, there was the atmosphere of disappointment. For some reason, I never worried that my research would turn up nothing, although more on that later. There was the question of what kind of story disappointment would make, and I held to the belief that it would be more revealing than a story of success. In any event, I felt the narrative of Xenakis in America wouldn't be one that diminished his work. I don't know if any of you have been following the critical uproar over Bjork's retrospective, currently on display at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, but that all of the critical invective is being aimed at the museum, and none of it seems to accrue to Bjork. So this notion of disappointment might really pertain to cultural institutions, and it's something very different than artistic failure. In researching my book, I visited archives and talked to eyewitnesses. I was amazed at how much documentary material from the 1960s had been lost. I have some feeling that the documentary record of a half a century ago is poorer than in years previous, perhaps because so many new types of document weren't appreciated for their historical value. Of course, today, everything is electronic, but we'll never be able to sift through it all. To list some of it, with respect to Tanglewood, the Berkshire Music Center maintains no public archive. The Boston Symphony preserves information about their concerts at Tanglewood, but apparently nothing about the school that Xenakis taught at. The Xenakis archive preserves most of the important documentation of that summer. There were many local newspapers that covered the activities of Tanglewood, but with the exception of those from before World War II, their archives have apparently disappeared. For example, Herbert Kupferberg covered the 1960s in his book on Tanglewood in 1976, but his bibliography is quite specific about the locations of his local news sources. But these archives can no longer be found. In a number of cases, it seems that these papers were bought by corporations like Knight Ridder, who first consolidated the old articles and photographs, but then at some time later disposed of them, I suppose in an effort to reduce costs. Another potentially rich source would have been the papers of Lucas Foss, but a fire at his house after his death destroyed the bulk of them. In terms of living witnesses, Gunther Schuller is alive, but he's quite busy and doesn't sit for interviews. What information I got from him contained small errors, and I only relied on matters that violinist Paul Zukowski could corroborate. Zukowski also got small things wrong. For example, his memory of chauffeuring Xenakis everywhere was contradicted by John Cale's memory of Xenakis driving him to Manhattan, and the driving maps of Canada preserved in the Xenakis archives. And just last week, his daughter, Maki Xenakis, confirmed that her father was a driver, showing me a letter where he had drawn his 1964 Corvair that he had bought for $750. Of the 25 students from that summer of 1963, only 5 replied to my initial email, and in the end, only Zukowski had the interest and recollections to sustain an interview. Like all of my best interviewees, Zukowski was useful for matters of fact, but perhaps more so for help in the evaluation of documentary evidence. In some respects, the Ypsilanti summer of 1966 has fared better than the Tanglewood summer of 1963. Clara Owen's papers are preserved at the University of Michigan, but they suffer from Owen's removal from the YGT board approximately a month before Xenakis' arrival. So at a critical moment, her record is reduced to a newspaper clipping file. The papers of the theater were finally entrusted to the Ypsilanti Chamber of Commerce, and my efforts to locate them suggest they were destroyed. Laura Bird's dissertation for Michigan State University contains some important interviews, but in general, Bird's study was about the arts organization and not about the productions. Of the interviews with the ensemble, the best witnesses were John Kitzman, whose professional career as a trombonist started there, and Paul Ganson, who studied the classics at Ann Arbor. The remainder were hard-pressed to distinguish between the production of the Oresteia and that of Aristophanes' Birds, but in fairness, their relationship was exclusively with the conductor Konstantin Simonovich, an indication of how hard-pressed Xenakis was while in Ypsilanti. The choreographer for Helen McGeehee and the dancers she put me in contact with had good memories, but again, only McGeehee had any contact with Xenakis. Most useful was a radio interview she made that summer of 1966, preserved in the New York Public Library, in which our artistic goals and choreography were discussed in detail. It mentioned a companion interview with the executive director Richard Kirshner, but my efforts to locate the tape or Kirchner himself came to nothing. My research at Indiana University had a completely different character. I had begun researching with Bloomington as a priority, but as my monthly unanswered emails to the head librarian at the music school approached a year's worth, I began to get worried. I had been processing articles from the New York Times, collecting everything they had written on Xenakis, but also Boulez, Berrio, Nono, Cage, Babbitt, and others. I had always thought that Boulez might be an interesting counterexample to Xenakis' experience in the US, but given my bad luck with Bloomington, I spent a good while mapping out Xenakis in America, relying chiefly on New York Times articles, which made me very unhappy. It seemed like the end of my project. Fortunately, I was saved by William Asprey, perhaps the leading scholar of computing history, who had just left Indiana University but was still answering his email there. My hope that he might be interested in my topic was rewarded when he sent me the names of several retired professors who had founded the computer science department while Xenakis was there. I came to realize that professors in Bloomington didn't move away when they retired. They were all easily accessible by phone or on foot. They introduced me to Donald Byrd, who had done the microsound graphs for formalized music, and to the librarian at the University Archives where all the relevant papers were housed. Much later, I met a very helpful reference librarian at the music school, and he explained that his boss never bothered to respond to emails. There are some difficulties with the university archives. A lot of student information is confidential, so for example, it's not possible to get a list of students who took the Introduction to Electroacoustic Music course, but never had an interest in Xenakis. I did manage to speak with practically all of Xenakis' close students, but I was unprepared for their perspective as students. They had been overwhelmed by their experience, the math, the marathon seminars, the high expectations. They were also not privileged to know that much about what was going on. Effectively, they weren't full colleagues. For example, several of them could remember Xenakis using the studio for his electroacoustic composition, but even the dating these memories to a specific semester proved impossible. By definition, Xenakis was using time when the students weren't around. To learn more about formalized music, I found Associate Editor Natalie Rubel's name on a local Indiana League of Women Voters website. They passed along my email, and one day I got a reply from her. She reported that some assistant in the late 1980s had the idea to create more space in the Indiana University Press basement and proceeded to destroy some 20 years of their production archives. Rubel's recollection was that the production had been uneventful, which only increases the missing archive's value for things like dating the waveform illustrations used in the essay, New Proposals in Microsound Structures. I'll end my tour of my research with two general observations. One, that I never received any response from private institutions. Among them, the Indiana University Foundation and the Gulbenkian Foundation, both major stakeholders in the funding of Xenakis synthesis hardware, failed to respond to my inquiries. The second concerns European secondary materials, essential for piecing together Xenakis' story both before and after his involvement in America. European scholarly publications are available in the US, but an understanding of what constitutes the European literature on a subject is not so easily acquired there. With all the destruction of documentation and failed memory, there were aspects of the story that I chose to leave out. One has a tangential relationship to Xenakis. One that has a tangential relationship to Xenakis is the fact that his student Bruce Rogers, who operated the computer every night in Paris for Polytope de Cluny, seems the first to have done granular synthesis on a computer. All evidence points to his doing this on the CNET computers almost immediately after they came online in 1972. I omitted to mention of this because Curtis Rhodes, who generally gets credit for this achievement, continued to develop his techniques, where Rogers eventually returned to the US, producing very interesting light shows with what he had learned from his work on Cluny, but choosing not to work far further on sound synthesis. Another circumstance concerns Xenakis' resignation letter, which remains confidential. I was allowed to read it, but couldn't make copies. One of Xenakis' points of resignation was the sloppy state of the studio, an implicit condemnation of the engineer Tom Wood. Given the very detailed bi-weekly reports Wood made concerning the construction of the synthesis hardware, a wonderful gift to our understanding of what happened, this could have been a central tension in my account of Xenakis' time at Bloomington. But I chose to play down the matter out of respect for Wood, who was still working at Bloomington. While I believe Wood had his own ideas about how to teach and maintain the studio that didn't support the efforts of Xenakis, Wood was in many ways in an untenable position. I interpreted his being hired as a way to reduce the cost of the computer hardware, given he was expected to build many of the analog circuits. With his primary responsibility to maintain the school's pipe organs, and as a junior staff member at the call of anyone wanting to do audio recording, he was obviously overcommitted. There was also the hostility that Xenakis attracted from the faculty. He had his supporters, but there were quite a few that resented his ability to command a sum of money equal to half the entire music school budget and be absent most of the year while expecting others to implement his project. Most of the faculty from that time, however, are dead, the remaining being Gary Whitlick, a music theory hire in 1967 who was still completing his dissertation at the University of Iowa. Whitlick was actually one of the anticipated other users of the synthesis hardware, and after 1972 wrote a number of journal articles on the pedagogical use of the system for ear training. The Princeton-educated composer John Eaton, who took over the CMAM after Xenakis' departure, is another whom I did not pursue for his point of view. In retrospect, I should have interviewed these figures and decided afterwards what their value their contribution had. But with time at a premium, I decided against it, believing that a detailed exploration of professional jealousy, if indeed Whitlick or Eaton remembered any, wasn't essential to my story. I had to decide on my portrayal of Xenakis' relations with women. Of my female interviewees, only choreographer McGeehee and conductor Fiora Cantino had actually met the man. In my research, I encountered evidence of a liaison with a student in the Tanglewood folders at the Xenakis archives, and someone at Bloomington suggested an affair with a member of Dean Bain's office, someone who helped Xenakis with his written English. I asked to interview two female students from Indiana University, one who declined, and another who said she remembered nothing of the period, actually not an unreasonable claim. So again, I left this material out, in part because the evidence was so partial, but I also believe out of respect, a decision which I leave for you to judge. Xenakis' critique of his students' work caused some harm, and I left these stories out because I couldn't get definitive permission to reproduce them. At Tanglewood, Xenakis flatly judged a 12-tone work by a composition student, quote, not very interesting, and afterwards the student was reduced to tears, which by chance Xenakis happened to witness. So the embarrassment was doubly reinforced. The student eventually gave up composition and took up writing, for which he realized he was better suited. At Bloomington, one of Xenakis' close students, one of the few involved in computer synthesis instead of tape composition, realized that Stokos, the stochastic music program, emphasized decisions of maximal music called contrast, and so decided to compose a piece of minimal contrast, modifying the program for this outcome. Xenakis heard the resulting work and of the process by which it was made and became furiously angry. In the student's account, Xenakis accused him of tampering with the program and misunderstanding the point of stochastic composition. The student told me that this was the reason he didn't complete his master's degree and never composed again, although he continued to work in the field of computer music. I was apparently the first person he had ever shared this experience with. I was initially taken aback by the story, but later asked him if I could include it anonymously, because I do think it demonstrates something of Xenakis' view of his work beyond the emotionality of the situation. Although I never got a no from the student, I also never got a yes, and therefore didn't pursue it further. There were also elements of my study that were ultimately undecidable. With as many gaps in the documentation as there were, any piece of narrative was ultimately an act of interpretation. The effort to find money for the synthesis hardware is a good example, where I had the documents that Dean Bain preserved, plus the minutes of the committee that actually awarded the money to the music school. But missing is the perspective of the University Foundation, as I mentioned, a private institution, and therefore missing the voices of two of the chief protagonists, Paul Klinge and Martha Mosier. I was also unable to locate the technical work of the groups such as Pepper, P-E-P-R, who respecified the converter design, or to discover who specified the first design that was abandoned. So my assertion that Xenakis stuck with his requirement for state-of-the-art equipment is ultimately an interpretation based on his statement to Balint Varga many years later that Indiana University doled out funds, quote, with an eyedropper. I didn't find documentary evidence that his wishes prevailed, and potentially imagined secondary uses, such as those of Whitlick's, may have been equally convincing to the funders. I had one area of undecidability solved for me before I completed the work. that of the fate of Balanchine's commission of Α.Π.Θ. Just months before I finished my work, Harvard University made public its archive of Balanchine's papers, which included all his correspondence with Xenakis. Prior to this, my narrative had offered a quote-unquote theory of what happened to Α.Π.Θ, whose premiere had been announced and advertised. The New York City Ballet was very loose in its commitments to new choreography, but I had presumed that the work had advanced a lot farther than it had. Their 1971 season featured a very expensive failure entitled PAMTGG, or Pan Am Makes the Going Great, choreographed to advertising music by Stan Applebaum and Sid Woloshin. Balanchine had spent close to $65,000 on sets and costumes, which are strikingly Greek in design and their symbolism tied in with the themes of A.Π.Θ. It seemed possible to make a link between counter-earth and counter-culture. My theory was that the music had proved too hard for the company, and with the investment in sets and costumes, they selected other, simpler music to redeem the investment. Of course, a misunderstanding was the real reason A.Π.Θ was never choreographed by Balanchine, where the orchestral parts languished in Salaber's New York office until Xenakis asked permission to premiere the work in Germany in 1974. The undecidability of two other aspects of Xenakis' time in America were more or less rehearsed in the pages of my book. The first pertains to the existence of a score for the Ypsilanti production of the Oresteia. I had done my research in the Xenakis archives when they were at the Bibliothèque Nationale in France. After I was back in New York, a French scholar, Anne-Sylvie Barthel-Calvé, sent me the complete set of finding aids for the archive, and I realized there was material I had missed, particularly the collection of scores. Without having examined all the evidence, I had to construct an argument for why there was no Ypsilanti score, or put another way, why the production book created by Alexis Solomos was the best guide to the difference